Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unlearning series from iShield.ai. As part of this series, we discuss with eminent personalities around various forms of biases and what we need to unlearn in order to become more inclusive at work. At iShield, we help companies create bias-free communications. So iShield comes as an AI assistant that helps people with inclusive language suggestions in job postings, internal messaging apps, and marketing communications. Our app is available on Slack, Microsoft Teams, Lever, Symphony Talent, etc. Today, we have our guest is Lenora Billings Harris, and she is a diversity and inclusion strategist who specializes in helping organizations make diversity, equity, and inclusion a competitive advantage by disrupting bias. She is the author of 2 books. She is included among the top 100 thought leaders on diversity by Society of Human Resource Management and is listed one of the top 30 diversity and inclusion leaders you must follow in 2022. Lenora is a past president of the Global Speakers Federation and was recently inducted into the Speaker Hall of Fame. A few of Lenora's clients include NASA, Genentech, Ritz-Carlton Hotels, Mercedes-Benz, etc., as well as numerous professional associations and universities. Additionally, Lenora serves as on the adjunct business school faculties of 2 universities. Let's get ready to learn. Please help me welcome Lenora Billings Harris.
Thank you so much. It is such a joy to be with you today.
Thank you. Today's topic is very important, and we are talking about microaggressions towards Black women at work. I want to start with a small personal impressions of this. I live in Bangalore in India, and our view about how Black women are at work is majorly shaped by Hollywood. And I started working in the IT industry 20 years ago. And for us, a customer in the US meant 80% of the time white male, and probably 20% of the time white, female. It never, we, at least the bias was so strong that we never considered other people to be our customers. But as I traveled more and I interacted and worked with more people, my worldview definitely changed. But it also triggered a strong sense of what do we need to unlearn, and that's where I want to start asking you, Lenora, how big is this problem? Can you just give some color around how prevalent, how big, and how do we identify this form of microaggression?
Certainly. And Kesavan, I'm so glad you started with the impact that media and Hollywood has, because when I started traveling internationally, that's when I really understood that people outside of the United States thinks that what they see on TV is how it is everywhere. Like if you watch if a soap opera is popular in a particular country, then folks in that country think that, oh, everybody's rich in the US, and that all Black people act the same way. And to your point, there are still very few Black women depicted in positive, strong roles. So that image is one that we do have to unlearn so that we can get closer to reality. And to your point, you have to unlearn before you can learn something new. So one quick example of that is over the last couple of years, many companies have looked at their behavior within the organization and also marketing and that type of thing. And some of them have actually changed the name of their products. So Aunt Jemima pancakes was very, very popular. It's in practically every household, the box of pancakes, which has this older, heavy set Black woman with a scarf tied around her head. And they ultimately realized how racist that is. And now they changed the name of that particular pancake mix too. I think it's Milling Company or something like that. So it doesn't have a person at all. To your point about how pervasive this is, there was a study done by McKinsey a few years ago on microaggressions as they relate to women in the workplace. And what they found was that there are more microaggressions directed toward Black women than any other group of women other than LGBTQIA. So LGBTQIA women receive the most microaggressions, and then Black women right behind that. And it's pervasive, it's constant, it's happening all the time, partly because the types of microaggressions that occur, and a microaggression is often subtle, and the person who is microaggressing has no idea that they're even doing it. And they're often, the people that do it are well intended. So what happens is it's happening all the time, every day, everywhere, whether it's within the workplace or, in the supermarket.
Yeah. I also happened to read that report. I think the percentage is greater than 84%.
Mm-hmm.
And they also mention how remote working has, while it provided opportunities, but from a microaggression standpoint, it only accentuated these biases or the microaggressions. So, great. Uh, of course, when you have a significant population towards whom microaggression occurs, it also must be costing these companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you? So, can you throw some light around what are these companies losing out?
Yes, well, as we know, most purchases, whether it's buying a house or a car or even the disposable items that are in the house, groceries or whatever, are those decisions are made at a much higher percentage by women. So, for instance, buying a car, whether it's a car for the family or for just two people, if there's, say, a spouse in the household and one is one is a male and one is a female, the woman still has 82% of impact on making that decision. So here's the problem. When companies are not recognizing the Black women in their market, or whether intentional or not, then they are shutting down the opportunity of really expanding their marketplace. So they really have to do several things, and I know we'll get into that, several
Yeah.
things to unlearn what
Mhm.
they've done in the past and be willing to reach out to that market, because Black women are going to vote with their dollars and their feet. When Black women don't feel appreciated and valued, they'll go somewhere else where they are appreciated and valued.
Yeah, I remember doing a audit of a Fortune 500 company's all product imagery, and saw that there was 1.6% representation of Black women across
Mhm.
their imagery. That's not a reflection of their employee base. That's not a reflection of their customer base. And no wonder this company had the maximum attrition rates also and customer attrition also, because the communication never authentically connected with the people whom they serve. So
Yeah, and
uh,
what companies will often say is, particularly from the internal perspectives, oh, we just can't find, qualified Black women. Frankly, I'm offended when anyone says qualified, whether it's Black women or men or whatever. I mean, of course, you're not going to hire somebody who's not qualified, but the implication, even in that type of phrase, is that there's just not that many people who will reach our standards. Well, the fact of the matter is, in 2022, it's because you're not looking in a broad enough source. You're not
yeah, yeah,
expanding where you're looking.
yeah. I think that a similar quote was made by Wells Fargo CEO. I think so. Okay, I do want to get a little bit deeper into how does these microaggressions manifest towards Black women at work.
Yes.
And one of the major things that we looked at was receiving comments based on appearance. Can you just throw some light around how does this manifest at work?
So in my work as a consultant and professional speaker, I am I shouldn't still be stunned, but I am at the kinds of things that still come up in the workplace. Many of those things are things I experienced when I was working in the corporate environment before I started my consulting work many years ago. The primary example, the one that comes up every time, has to do with Black women and their hair. For some reason, people who are not Black think it's okay to put their hand on the head or in the hair of a Black woman. Now, that oftentimes happens when they're intending to give a compliment. However, what happens is they'll say, "Oh, and I like your hair so much," and their hand is in their hair. Even with my very short hair, I've had that happen to me where someone will pat me on the head. And I do respond very directly, "I am not your pet. I'm not a dog or a cat." And of course, folks will apologize. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it." But I always hope that it's a learning moment, because Black women do have the luxury of putting their hair in many different styles. You can compliment it without having to touch it. And you also could just do some more homework on the many different styles that Black women wear their hair in, or the wigs that they wear, that type of thing. In addition to that, though, although hair is by far the one that comes up most often, then people will also make comments about the clothes that people wear, the shoes that they wear. And here's the thing: the comparison is always as though whatever the white standard is, or the white practice is, the assumption is that's the standard. That is what everyone else should do. Now, why is that important? Because what that says is you're diminishing people of other cultures, in this case, Black women. So if a Black woman doesn't happen to walk, talk, or dress like the white women in the workplace, then somehow she should do the changing. So it manifests itself as Black women feeling that they need to cover. And what cover means is not really show up being authentically who you are, because you don't think you're going to be accepted. It also causes what Catalyst calls, and if you go to catalyst.com, you'll be able to see all the research they've done in this area, and what they call emotional tax. And the research wasn't just about Black women, but about Black people. And now they're expanding that research. But the point is that when Black women come to work, for example, they are carrying a load. They already know that there are so many stereotypes and biases and attitudes about who they are by a category, not who they are as an individual. And so they have to use extra energy to try to fit in and then be heard. Yet, even when they do, and that's what covering is, but even when they do that, they still get interrupted in the workplace. People say, "Are you sure about that?" When maybe the Black woman really is the highest level expert in the room. They get cut off. And people, just make comments about them that other people think are funny, and somehow they think the Black person is supposed to respond. So that emotional tax they bring then ultimately shows up physically, because any stress that we have as human beings, our brain can't differentiate between physical pain and emotional pain. And so it has an impact on our health, our self-esteem, and so many other things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, going back to the Hollywood part that I mentioned, the other ways that I saw my own impressions in a wrong way, but develop is a depiction of body type, or
Mm.
skin tones, tone of voice. That seemed to be another huge one. Tone of voice,
Yes.
talking to emotionally. I do want to understand how at work, again, at work, these things should not be tolerated, but how does it manifest? And
Yes, and so uh, the stereotype is the angry Black woman, and Black women are stuck between a rock and a hard place, essentially, because if they speak up, then so that they can be heard, because so often they're ignored. And I say they, even though I am a Black woman, but I'm speaking in broader terms. But if they speak up, then some will say, oh, they're just too emotional about this, or they're angry. If they don't speak up, then they don't get heard. And if they're in a work environment where there are no allies or advocates pulling them back into the conversation, then people think, oh, they must not be qualified. They must not know what they're doing in this job. And as it relates to skin tone, I didn't realize, excuse me, I didn't realize until I was, probably in my 30s, when I started really studying all of this in great detail, how pervasive skin tone is across the world. And what we know is that the lighter you are, the more likely you will have an easier acceptance in the workplace. Now, of course, that doesn't mean every person, but because I am a more fair-skinned Black person, when I reflected on my own experiences, even in elementary school, I began to realize, oh, in school, when I was the one that was talking too much, the teacher would yell at the person I was speaking to if they were another Black person and their skin was darker than mine. I didn't get in trouble as much. And what was the difference? There really only was one, is I was had a lighter complexion than the other person. What we know through research, and you'll just see this everywhere, is among skincare products, beauty products, the most money is made by those products that say lightener or brightener in them. So it's not just a Black issue, it's across the world that the skin tone or colorism, which is actually what it's called, is an issue. And so what we need to unlearn is to pay attention to how we interact with people based on their skin color, and
yeah,
then make sure we're not equating that to competence.
yeah, thank you. The other aspect is people make assumptions about, sometimes it's about how a Black woman's personal life would be, or should be. I mean, these assumptions can run deep based on the biases. And I saw an advertisement in a store where there was a price tag put on the product that was meant for Black women, but there was no price tag put. Just on the next shelf, right? No price tag put on the product that was meant for white skin tone, right?
Hmm.
I'm just, another way of, making assumptions. So I want you to cover a little bit about what kind of assumptions at work, specifically in a work context, people make about personal lives of Black women, and how does that impact, whether in terms of inclusion or including in social events. I just would like to get
Yes.
a
And so
deeper understanding of that, please.
one quick comment about your experience in the store. Only recently, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, have we begun to see mannequins that have a darker skin tone. Most of them always have a white skin tone. And again, it's about recognizing and thinking through those types of things and the subtle message that it sends. Also, the image, and you brought this up earlier, the image of Black women always being larger in commercials and on TV shows. It's like every Black woman is not large, but that's what you tend to see. So in the workplace, very often what happens is, because of all of these things we just discussed, there will be an assumption that the Black woman is not as qualified as other people. maybe she doesn't speak quite the same way. And so the focus ends up being on her characteristics instead of her qualifications. In my own research, done through one of the universities with whom I'm associated, what we discovered was that one of the primary reasons that Black people, and most more Black women than even men, one of the reasons that they leave organizations is because they don't get mentored the same way that white people do and that men do. And why does that happen? Because if their supervisor happens to be a white man, for example, often he is so afraid that he's going to say the wrong thing and get sued for it, which is an emotional response because that's not reality, that they end up not giving any feedback at all. And so they don't get the professional development. And if they speak up and ask for what they want, then you still are stuck with that angry woman, angry Black woman syndrome. So it's a learning process that needs to happen throughout the whole organization and all of the leaders. And then the other problem that happens is, well, it's easier for me to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. And unfortunately, silence is compliance. So in today's world, when you're not speaking up and the only information you have is what you see coming from Hollywood and from the media in general, instead of doing the work to learn more about this particular demographic and then interact directly more often with Black women, then you're going to continue to perpetuate the biases that you have.
Yeah, you brought up a very important point earlier when you were talking about giving people that learning moment or the micro learning moment. We did a study to understand, will people take a corrective action based on feedback that they would receive in private. And overwhelming majority of people, almost 81% of people said that they would love to learn and correct their behavior. So it goes with the other point that if you don't speak, or if there is no representation, if you don't speak, if you don't engage, or if you don't ask, then you have also lost an opportunity to learn and course correct for future.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And what comes to mind is you're going to make mistakes. I mean, I've been doing this work for over 30 years at this point. So I'm focusing on DEI types of things all the time. And still I'm learning. Still, I every now and then might use a term that is not as good as another term that I could have used. And I welcome when my clients or my audience members say to me, usually it would be offline, it'll be after the presentation or the meeting, and they'll say, you used whatever term it was. And even though it might be a term that a lot of people use on a regular basis, the point is, if I want to be effective as a leader, then I need to be willing to be curious enough to be open-minded to that feedback. So even when, let's say, for instance, you really are curious about a Black woman's hair, then first do some homework. Google makes it very easy for you to get lots of information before you ever approach the person, because then it'll at least reflect that you've done a little bit of homework, and then you can validate it with that person. Because the other thing that happens so often is Black women are presumed to be a monolith, that all of us are exactly alike and we think alike. So if you do a little bit of homework and then you have a conversation with someone in the workplace who happens to be a Black woman, you can have a very instructive conversation that is a conversation and a learning rather than a condemnation or a microaggression. But you have to be willing to put in that energy.
Got it. Yeah. The other type very common is to appoint or nominate or ask a Black woman to be a representative. You spoke about the monolith, right? this is very relevant to that, is about asking a Black woman to be a representative or speak on behalf of all the Black women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And uh, again, this personally, I believe that is actually taxing the person more than what they should. But I would love to hear, how does this manifest at workplaces, and what does this do? Um,
Yes. Hmm. Absolutely. It's going to build on that emotional tax that I talked about earlier. And here's the thing is that, and many companies do exactly what you just described, is they will go to that one Black person, Black woman they have, or the, couple of Black people, Black women that they have, and assume that they can speak for all of them. The fact of the matter is, across the world, what we know when we look at bias that you and I both do on a regular basis is that people have more in common geographically than they do by race or ethnicity, depending
yes.
on what it is you're looking at. So, for example, and I know this podcast is global. In my case, I was born in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. And when I meet a Black woman, if I assume that she thinks just like me, and maybe she's from Alabama or maybe she's from Minnesota, I'm most likely going to make a mistake because her life experiences and her worldview could be very different than mine. Now, we may have many things in common, but the point is when organizations go to that one person to speak for everyone, they are immediately microaggressing, and they're putting a lot of pressure on that person. And frankly, what Black people tell me, Black women in particular, is that they are exhausted because since the murder of George Floyd, when 2 years ago, when so many companies took a deeper dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially as it relates to Black people, is their intentions were good, but they kept going to Black people assuming that we have all the answers. When the problem is not us, the problem is other people not being willing to do the work to disrupt those biases in their workplace so that everyone can show up and be more authentic.
Yeah. I want to touch upon one topic that also came up in the comment section. I think Catherine posted that around gaslighting. And how does that, happen at workplaces, and how does it manifest? I would like you to, talk a little bit more about this aspect.
So gaslighting, did she give an example of how
No,
she's meaning it?
I think she just mentioned a phrase, and now it's gone
Mm,
in the
yeah,
comments. But choice between silence or gaslighting. That's the phrase
right.
that she used. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So
yeah.
earlier I said, silence is compliance. And what I mean by
Yes.
that is when you experience or see a microaggression happening and you do nothing, that's the silence. And then the gaslighting is when that Black person, that Black woman does speak up or does disagree, for instance, with some of the things that are spoken. Then very often what happens is rather than someone who may have a different perspective, rather than them going to the Black woman and having a conversation about it to get better understanding, they'll talk to other people. And in today's world of social media, it makes it so easy to just pretty much flame or gaslight gaslight another person. And the point that it's so much easier to have a conversation, to not necessarily feel that you have to be converted or that you're going to change your perspective, but to just get a deeper understanding. Today, everybody's so angry that they just want to lash out at other people and criticize. And we know how much that damages and how much it hurts. I mean, how many suicides have we heard of for young people when they're gaslighting each other and then and saying you should die and things like that, and then they commit suicide.
Okay. Okay. That's okay. Um, I want to touch upon another aspect, which is around making or hearing derogatory jokes in a workplace about you,
Mm-hmm.
and and then after that, the justification is, oh, that was just a joke. And then
Yes.
there are various forms of justifying that. You understand the emotion behind it is another way. But particularly towards Black women, what are some of the things that they hear or they face at workplaces,
Mhm.
which are derogatory and are brushed off as jokes or whatever?
Yeah. Well, what people do is when they say something and they mean it, but then they immediately recognize it didn't quite land the way they intended, that's when they'll say, oh, it was just a joke. So,
Hmm.
in other words, we use humor to try to justify our biases. Now, going back to how our brains operate, our brains don't know the difference. Once that microaggression has happened, even if the other person says, oh, it was just a joke, first of all, who is it funny? To whom is it funny? Is it funny to the person who said it? And now you're putting the Black woman on the spot, like she's supposed to, like, oh, okay, it was a joke, so now I'm not going to feel bad. It just doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
So what could be done more effectively, so that you're not, or so that you're at least trying to repair to some degree that microaggression, is when you say or do something that doesn't quite land right, instead of saying, oh, it was just a joke, own it. So you might say something to me and that didn't land right for me. Now, recognizing every Black woman is not the same. So you might do something or say something to one Black woman and it was no no impact at all, and you'll have an impact with another person. But be willing to own it so you can learn. Let me give you an example. Excuse me. One of the ways that microaggression comes up among Black women and really underrepresented groups in general is when they have an ethnic name.
Hmm.
So a name that doesn't fit the larger population. So in the US, if you have an Anglo name like Bob, Harry, Mary, Susan, then that would be an Anglo name and that would be standard, let's say, mainstream. If your name is Marquesa or Quinetta, or some other name that sounds more ethnic, then people make fun of those names. People don't learn how to pronounce them. And the name is the most precious thing we own. It's the first thing that was given to us.
Hmm.
And when people make fun of those names, then that's a microaggression, even though it may seem to be subtle. And I don't know if this happens in India, but in the US, instead of people learning how to say the name correctly, they'll give the person a nickname that they didn't ask for. Now, and by the way, this research is global. So in India, for instance, if someone has an Anglo name rather than a more Indian sounding name, then they would suffer the same way. And what the research shows is, from a hiring perspective, people with ethnic sounding names that are not the mainstream have to apply 5 times more often. I did my own research in this area, so I'll tell you 2 quick stories. One is I had a woman that was working for me whose name was Kenya Nicole, and she's African American. When she graduated college and now is looking for a full time position, we did an experiment. As she sent out her resumes, on half of them, she listed her first name as Kenya,
Hmm.
on the other half, Nicole. And her experience was exactly the same as the research indicates. She had to try 5 times more to get in the door when her first name was listed as Kenya. And and with some of the organizations to whom she applied, she sent exactly the same resume. All she did was change her name. In my
Oh.
case, my name is Lenora. It's not particularly ethnic, but for some reason, a lot of people want to shorten it.
Hmm.
And one time I had this situation where someone called me Lynn, and I kept not responding. I just didn't know she was talking to me because I don't have a nickname, and so Lynn has never been my name. And then finally, she walked up to me. She says, "Lynn, don't you hear me talking to you?" And she knows my name. And so I said, "Well, my name is not Lynn. My dad named me Lenora, and I really like that name. I'd appreciate it if you would use it." So my point is, you don't have to, like, knock a person between the eyeballs, but respond and help them know what you want them to do instead. But taking the time to learn how to say a person's name correctly is an important step towards saying, I value who you are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I lived in UK, London for a very long time, and I used to play cricket. And I was always called Case. So I was Case, Case. You would hear on a sports field in an 8-hour game, Case 100 times. And my name is not Case, right? It just doesn't fit. So, and it's hurtful. So I did correct them. But I can totally relate to this. Um, the other aspect is, I mean, you did touch upon how the words and phrases or that people would use in recruitment. You touched about how people change their ethnic sounding names, but the other aspect is, what are some of the representation or words or phrases people use in marketing that's actually propagating these microaggressions?
Hmm. And by the way, I know you asked me about, what are some of the things people hear being said about them in the workplace. Most
Yeah.
often, Black women don't hear it directly.
Mm.
So it'll be other people talking about them, and then they might accidentally hear it. And when that comes to them, it's usually comments again that um, are trying to depict that they just don't fit. And so when organizations, whether it's through their marketing, which I'll get back to, or just their internal interactions, very often when we say, this person is a good fit, what we're really saying is, oh, this person is more closely aligned to the dominant culture. So
Mm.
in black white terms, that means, oh, this black person can fit more easily into our white culture. We'll be comfortable with that person as opposed to someone else who might be even more qualified. And you may need that diversity of thought on your teams. In fact, you always want more diversity of thought. But the person who is more qualified, who also happens to be another Black woman, might not be considered because people are uncomfortable, whether it's her body size or her hairstyle or how she talks. Again, going to characteristics instead of to qualifications. So, from the marketing perspective, companies get in trouble all the time, and I know in your own research you come across the same kinds of things that I do as well. And one example was a company a couple of years ago had this commercial, or rather a print ad, and they were selling pajamas. So they had two families represented, with one family, a white family, with a dad figure, a mom figure, and two kids, and they all were dressed in the same pajamas that this company was trying to sell. So, it looked really nice that they were all dressed in this holiday, it was Christmas, holiday, excuse me, pajamas. Right next to them was another picture. And this picture was of a Black woman, presumably the mom, and two kids. There were two problems with this picture. The father figure was not there. So
Mm.
there's this presumption that Black women do not have male figures in their home as a good male figure to the children. And that's a stereotype. And the other problem was that the pajamas they had on were striped, red and white stripes.
Oh.
And this company suffered greatly with all the pushback. They had to spend lots of money apologizing and then redoing this because so many people, not just Black people, because we all want to be focused on what's more inclusive and what's not. But there was so much pushback because those pajamas looked like prison uniforms. So you had two subtle stereotypes going on at the same time. Now, here's the point. If they had people around the table making the decision that represented diversity of thought, so it would help if there was a Black person sitting around the table, but you can have white people that are more um, enlightened about cultural differences, who might have also said, "I don't know about that picture of the Black family." So you need to have that diversity of thought, because when you don't, you will make so many more mistakes. And those types of examples are just pervasive. They happen all the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's very powerful. At least that's one of the insights that we are using to say technology can help be more consistent. I'll talk about that a little bit later, because that goes into how we kind of gone ahead and building iShield.ai. But I do want to cover another aspect, which is around internal communications. This is people talking to each other, and they use words and phrases in the way you talk, as simple things as "you go girl."
Hmm.
Right? I want to get a sense of things that people say as you talk with your colleagues based on assumptions or whatever that is,
Hmm.
but they are again propagating microaggressions. There probably is a better way, um, or if you don't know, ask. But I do want to understand, again, words and phrases in the way you talk to each other.
Yes. So I'll use the example, go back to the example I was using a moment ago, where I might have more in common with people who are from New Jersey, like I am, regardless of whether they're Black or white, versus having more things in common with a Black woman from Minnesota, right? So an example would be if a Black woman starts talking to me, and it could be another Black woman, and then definitely across cultures, across ethnic groups. If a white woman starts talking to me and she says, "Oh, you go girl," but she really doesn't know me, then that can be offensive, because she's making an assumption that that's how I communicate. Now, please understand, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the phrase "you go girl," but before you get that familiar, you need to first get to know the person. So, one of the things that I share with my clients is, it's better to err on being too formal in the beginning than being too familiar in the beginning. So, get to know the person first, be a little bit more formal, don't make assumptions. And then as you get to know them, then many of those barriers will begin to go down. You'll get to know how it is the other person is comfortable communicating. And certainly that's one of the things that I am constantly paying attention to when I'm traveling internationally, because with today's, excuse me, um, today's very multicultural world, on this small globe that we live on, that every culture doesn't communicate the same way. So when I started paying more attention to how to be appropriate in other countries, that's when I also started noticing how many microaggressions happen right within my own country. So don't assume that what you see on TV or in the movies in regards to how people speak is appropriate for you to do, especially if you are not in the same ethnic group. And I would suggest that even beyond Black women communicating or listening to other people communicate with them who are not Black, even generationally, there's a difference. So I don't happen to have kids, and so I didn't learn about rap and hip hop and all that if I had had kids and they were listening to it. So I had to educate myself around what that is and learn for myself that all of it is not bad and it's not all derogatory. But my point is that sometimes I see people trying to speak in the vernacular of hip hop to a Black woman as though that's going to make them closer. And what it does is it separates, because it says, you don't know me and you are still only seeing me stereotypically. So, again, don't be afraid to speak, be willing to speak. And then if you make a mistake, say, oops, I can see that didn't land right. Help me know how to do this more effectively. Help me know what would work better, rather than saying, oh, it was just a joke, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, you brought up a very, very interesting point, and I'll also let in a little secret. So we uh, teach our AI to detect stereotypes. So it basically is able to read a sentence and say, that's a stereotype association. And it's a very hard problem from a computer science point of view, right? So one of the areas where we look for data is actually these TV shows, because that is the gold mine from a data standpoint to actually know how are these stereotypes propagated.
Mm-hmm.
What are the words and phrases people use in, let's say, the TV show Office, right? And there's enough and more, because that is what is probably, the world over people are watching, and that's probably the language that people will use
Mm-hmm.
uh, most often than not. And then that becomes the data to say, okay, what's the stereotype, you
Mm-hmm.
know and then, can you teach your AI to detect that when it is spoken that way? You brought up that point around, don't assume that how it is said in that TV show is how people are. So
Well,
uh,
and the other thing to consider is that internationally, the type of TV shows that are going to show up in your country and many other countries are typically the TV shows that are the least expensive in the syndication.
mhm,
So you're not necessarily going to see shows that will depict more reality in regards to better role modeling and that type of thing. Well, the first time I went to South Africa, it was when Michael Jackson was really, really popular.
mhm,
And they only had, this was in the early 90s, so they've come a long way since then. But back then, they only had TV for a couple of hours an evening. And they would see Michael Jackson, in various ways, and they would see the soap opera, The Bold and the Beautiful. Well, that soap opera, everybody's rich, and they have gigantic diamond rings and so forth. And so people would ask me, well, have you met Michael Jackson? It's like, well, I'd have to explain. It's no, he's not just out and about, and it's a big country and all of that.
yeah.
And they really did assume that what they were seeing was reality for the United States. So not only recognize that you don't want to necessarily believe that what you're seeing is the norm, but also recognize that the reason you're seeing it is because those are the shows that are the least expensive to show internationally, and usually are not going to be the ones that will have good role modeling.
Yeah, yeah. We face that. I mean, I come from India. We face that because the worldview of India is shaped by Bollywood.
Yes.
I traveled in Egypt, and they would ask me to sing a Bollywood song, and I didn't know the language. I mean, in India, we speak numerous languages. I
Yes.
didn't know the language. I didn't know what to sing. I didn't know what dance moves to make. So I was not Indian enough. But they were very kind people when I explained to them, hey, this is how we are. And so they were, oh, I'm so sorry. And then, but, it's we do face face some of it, because of the popular media. One another point that did come up in the questions or chat is around customer support and or support in general, and how does in customer care or customer support or microaggressions manifest towards Black women.
Mhm.
Can you cover a few examples or things that you've come across?
Certainly. So one of the things that happens to many Black women is when they enter the store, if it's a retail, they enter the store, there's an assumption that they're probably going to steal something. And so Black women and Black men tend to get followed around in the store by security or by other people that work there far more than white people do. When they're about to pay for whatever they're buying, they will be more likely to be asked to show identification than a white person in line about to purchase the same thing. And my husband and I have experienced this personally. Now, both of us tend to will speak up. And in one occasion, when that happened, my husband said, well, may I please see the supervisor? And then when the supervisor came, may I see your policy? Because we had just experienced a white woman in front of us who paid by check. Like, so slow down the line and she's got to write out a check. The clerk did not ask for any identification and just took the check and everything was fine. And then when we got ready to pay for our merchandise, my husband pulled out a credit card and the clerk wanted to see additional identification, which hadn't been asked before. And so, unfortunately, we end up having to speak up in situations like that. But going beyond retail, or the retail industry, one of the ways that these microaggressions and these biases show up is through healthcare. So caring for patients, um, when patients, whether they're going to the doctor or they're actually in the hospital, there's huge disparity. So Black women are presumed to have a higher level of pain, so that we can experience
Tolerance.
more pain
Yeah,
than
tolerance
other
to pain.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like
I
ridiculous.
think
And
Serena Williams also spoke about the experience she has had as a Black woman during childbirth, isn't it? In healthcare, I think there was something. Yeah,
yes, yes, higher
someone
level of,
like Serena
because we're
Williams.
not believed when we say something is wrong. And Serena
Yeah.
Williams will be a perfect example of this. When we say something is wrong, we're not believed. And so you might have to go to 2 or 3 doctors to get whatever the ailment is treated. And and then even when the doctor is listening, very often the remedy is different, or the treatment, I should say, is different than what they would give to a white woman experiencing exactly the same thing. Again, coming from the bias of this person is probably exaggerating, or they're not going to take their medication anyway. There's just so many dynamics. And certainly in the medical field, I've worked with many different medical professionals, and there are many organizations that are working on remedying this, but it is so deeply built into the systems that it's a very difficult process to move that needle to get better outcomes.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about what can companies do. We have explored various aspects about how microaggressions manifest, and how microaggressions manifest in communications, whether it is recruitment, marketing, customer care. I want to talk about, okay, once companies recognize they need to take action, how what can they do?
Yes. So we talked about companies going to Black women and asking them, what should we do? You should have focus groups. I would recommend that you do have some focus groups so that you can begin to hear what goes on in your workplace. And you want to do an assessment. You have to find out where you are now. So have a diversity assessment. But that's not enough, because people are not going to write down what they experience every day. So you also need to have focus groups where you create a safe environment for small groups of Black women to share what their everyday experience is, so you can hear that. And when I say you, what I'm meaning is leaders need to hear that. And they need to know how to have those focus groups so the leader is listening. And I spent a lot of time doing that, especially over these last 2 years after George Floyd was murdered, and had to educate the leaders on, here's what your role is. You're used to wanting a quick solution to everything, but your role is to listen with empathy, and to not try to say, well, and I experienced something similar, because if you're not a Black woman, you did not experience something, trying to make it less painful. That might be your intention, but rather to just listen with empathy. So you want to have focus groups. You want to do an assessment. You want to measure your progress. And this is the one area, diversity and inclusion in general is the one area where companies get nervous about measuring this. Well, you measure everything else and you reward leaders for everything else. So how are you going to know if you make progress? Then additionally, though, if you have BRGs, business resource groups, or ERGs, employee resource groups, they're also called. And these are affinity groups where you give opportunities, in this case, Black women, to come together so that they can support one another, but more importantly, so that they can share what ideas they do have on what the organization can do. That should be sponsored by an executive in the organization. And preferably, what I recommend to my clients is it doesn't need to be a Black woman as a sponsor, because most of the time you don't have high level Black women in the organization. But even if you do, have a white male or an Indian male, of course, depending on what country you're in, have a male be the sponsor. Why? Because their role is to learn. And that way, when they're in their everyday regular work, they will learn how to be better advocates and allies. They'll learn how they can speak up when there is a microaggression happening in the workplace, like somebody is interrupting the Black woman or they're not hearing the Black woman. That leader can pull that Black woman back into the conversation, and the leader's behavior will begin to be noticed by other people in addition to the Black woman. But my point is that their behavior can then become more of the norm, in addition to that business resource group providing opportunities for people to learn and for people to uncover ways that the business can be better. So this should be part of your overall diversity, equity, inclusion, justice strategy. But if you're wanting to get people feeling that you see that they exist, then you want to create safe opportunities for them to share their information. And you want to hold your leaders accountable for making progress in this area, and not just hiring progress. That's the easy part, getting more diversity. The inclusion part is the harder one. How do you keep them? How do you create that work environment where everybody can show up and be authentic? How do you develop the skill to be able to speak up when microaggressions do happen? Don't assume that it always has to be the person who was microaggressed that they should speak up, because very often it's too risky for them to speak up. You, the leader, need to show that you see them, you hear them, and you advocate for them.
Yep. And you mentioned about measurement. One of the things that we do is to provide a degree of inclusion score, a report on how people communicate or how brands communicate externally. And it's about representation, and representation matters, right? So, because one of the premises, I don't think there is a human being whom you can call as 100% inclusive. So, every single day, what you can do is to improve your degree of inclusion. So if you measure is only when you can improve your degree of inclusion. So that's one of the fundamental principles of how we are building our products. I want to take one question. This is from Montrese. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correct. Otherwise, I apologize. Montrese Hardy. I'm wondering how Kesavan and Dr. Lenora feel on their thoughts on Wilkerson's cast and that impact on microaggressions in the workplace. I apologize, I haven't heard. I don't know what Wilkerson's cast issue is. I don't know this phrase. Have you come across this before, Lenora? Are you aware of this?
No, I'm not. So, every opportunity to learn. So I'm going to have to do some work to Wilkerson's cast. I'm
Yeah.
not. Oh, unless she was talking about the book. That's what she's talking about. I happen to have the book right here. She's talking about this book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it just happens to be in arm's length, so I can reach it there.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, I found it to be so fascinating. What the author did is she talked about racism in America and across the world, and how it correlates to the caste system in India. Now, she doesn't only talk about India. She also talks about the Nazis and what they did as it relates to what they learned about slavery in the U.S. To oppress people. So, absolutely an excellent book. I have the audio book as well, and I've listened to it more than once. I think it is what she did is really help people understand racism and various isms for that matter, but mostly she was focusing on racism, and by comparison. So when you think of the caste system in, or at least when you think of it, how people stereotypically know about the caste system worldwide, and what we know about slavery, and then all of the ways slavery has impacted Black people, not just in the US, but even in other countries. I thought she did an excellent job of
Okay.
educating us by balancing those two.
I will read that book, and then I'll write about it. That's all the time we have for Q&A. I learned a lot, and also being in Bangalore in India and not living in the US, there is a lot to unlearn. With all the impressions that I have collected about Black women and how are they treated at work, but I promise to make progress every single day. That's and Thank you for sharing all your experiences, Lenora. I hope that the audience who managed to listen to us enjoyed, learned, and from you or from your experiences. So thank you very much.
It's been my absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for those of you who sent in questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.